Hey, we're back. Spatial Shark with you for Unit 2, Population and Migration Patterns and Processes. You might be familiar with this image. This is the Shibuya crossing in Tokyo, Japan. And, Tokyo is a good place to start when we're talking about population and migration patterns and processes, because after all, this is a city of 30 plus million people. This is one of the most famous intersections. Just look at that humanity. When we took kids to Japan on one of our spring break trips just a couple of years ago, being here was almost surreal. And there's a Starbucks across the street, and you can go upstairs, and it has kind of a observation point out there. And just to, make like a little time-lapse video is just a lot of fun. But what are we going to be talking about in this video about population and migration patterns and processes? Well, obviously, we know that the Greeks invented this concept of geography. And so therefore, it's not a big surprise that they'll also be the ones to talk about demography. And demos is the Greek word for people. And therefore, when we study population, we're going to be talking about demography. And you'll see things like demographic statistics, right? So be prepared for that. One of the first things that we talk about in Unit 2, and this is kind of, topic 2.1, is population distribution. And there's really two words. And I almost wish they had both words in the title, but they talk about distribution, but it's important we also know density, right? Now, density is something that you guys probably have a great deal of familiarity with because you've probably learned that density is mass divided by volume. Well, the same thing with population. It's the number of people living in an area, and then you divide by the size, the physical size of that area. And this is just a down and dirty calculation of mass divided by volume, population divided by the available space. However, this is an arithmetic number, and we're going to talk about the different kinds of densities in one of the slides coming up in just a minute. Distribution is more where are the people living. It's not so much how many, it's more the pattern. And remember, you've heard me say already a lot this year about patterns and processes. Patterns are what we see. The processes are the economic, social, cultural, political, and environmental conditions that make those patterns the realities that they are. You could say, for example, the United States population, if you go back to our first census in 1790, we were very much on the Atlantic seaboard, hadn't yet begun that westward momentum. So now we see the distributive center of the United States, after we've moved south and west for so many decades, is now somewhere in the middle of rural Missouri. And they have this big obelisk. If you drive out there, you can go see it, right? But that's the idea of distribution versus density. For the first time in human history, if you think about distribution of our population in the world, we have just over 50% of human population living in urban places. We have tended to be rural for most of human history. And this is partly due to the idea of slums, which we'll save for an urban unit, which is Unit 6 towards the end of the year. But we need to know that there is a huge trend of rural to urban migration that we're going to see in this unit. Okay. And we know that we have different types of maps, right? Thematic maps tell a story. We learned that in Unit 1. And so now we're going to use those thematic maps, both choropleth maps, dot maps, all kinds of cartograms, graduated symbol, proportional symbol, all kinds of isolines, really getting into depth with these thematic maps that tell stories about where people live. Okay. So, when we think about isoline and cartogram, those are going to be a little more interesting when we use those, cartograms especially, because remember that the size of the countries or the political spaces will be adjusted for size to illustrate the quantitative data. With the isoline, you got the, again, the squiggly lines. And remember, every time you cross a line, you're changing value in that quantitative data. Now, I like showing kids these three images here because when you look at it, we're going to assume that all three of these spaces are the exact same physical size, the same area. Remember, mass divided by volume? This is the same volume all three times. You can see the scale indicator there at the bottom. And we see that this is a very localized scale, right? Because it's only a couple hundred feet. But what's interesting is that you start to count the houses. Right? And if you count, you're going to see that on the top one, right, there are fewer houses than in the one in the middle, right? I'll give you a second. Go ahead and count for yourself. So now that you've counted, right, you'll agree that you see the road pattern is even the same, right? And when you look at that, you're going to see that the same pattern, but a different quantity. So a different density, right? And obviously density changes. In the bottom one, the same physical space, and now the density hasn't changed from the middle one. It's the distribution. Where are those houses being placed now? Okay. So as you look through this, you can see the differences between what we talk about with density and what we talk about with distribution, right? So density different in the top two, but the distribution is similar, right? And in the bottom two, right, the density is the same, right? But now the distribution is totally different. So think about worldwide. Where do we see the greatest density of humans living in the world? Now, we know we've got two countries with in excess of 1 billion people, China and India. But India, being a little bit physically smaller, has a greater density than, say, China does. China is a physically bigger country, even though it has slightly more people. But you can see very quickly here that we have a lot of countries that are very, very densely populated. South Korea, Bangladesh, right? We can see the Netherlands in Europe. We can see Guatemala in the Western Hemisphere. All of these are populations, not necessarily big populations, but very densely packed populations, right? And usually we show choropleth for density because the darker the color, the higher the density, right? If we want distribution, we typically show that in the form of dots, right? The distribution of the dots. Of course, remember, we always have drawbacks with these different kinds of maps. You know, count the dots in northern India. Count the dots in eastern China. It's very, very difficult. Count the dots in Tokyo, Japan. It's almost impossible, right? So this is why sometimes in an area of density, we would prefer the colors. But the problem with this is we see India as being very dense, but we don't exactly know where in India that density is. And by the way, if you know anything about India, a lot of that population is on what they call the Deccan Plateau, which is in the northern part of the country, the breadbasket of India, where most of the agriculture is centered. And this is where you have big, super high populations of people living in India. Right? So again, density versus distribution. And remember, scale of analysis as we zoom in and zoom out. This is a global map, but it's a national scale of analysis because we're showing country by country by country data, right? Here, the same thing, global map, national scale of analysis, okay? So we have to think about how scale affects what we see. So what are some of these consequences of population distribution and density? We know that all over the world, population is unevenly distributed. And as I just mentioned, even within, say, India, that's very densely populated, the whole country is not at the same uniform level of density. You've got some parts of the country that have more people per square mile and some parts that have less, okay? So when we map this, remember, as I just said, we got the scale of analysis issue. Are we looking at this globally? You know, we could look at all 7.7 billion people in the world and say, okay, where are they, right? We could look at this regionally. We could compare East Asia to South Asia. You know, China and India anchor those two different regions. We could look at Latin America versus Sub-Saharan Africa. Or we could change the scale of analysis, zoom in a bit, and look at just a country of data. And we could say, okay, United States versus Mexico versus Canada, right? We could look at a subnationally, and we could go below the country scale. And then we could start looking at parts of the United States, right? Or we could look at parts of China, parts of India. And we could even get all the way down to the local level and say, okay, what about in Palm Beach County, right? What's the density and what's the distribution of the population within our local space? So again, I mentioned mass divided by volume. And this is what we sometimes will call arithmetic population density or arithmetic, right? You're basically just doing the math. But this is not a super useful tool because we don't know enough about where these people are living. What kind of soil does it have? Is it going to be sustainable to live there? What's the quality of life and those kinds of things? We just know a calculation, right, with the arithmetic. So it ignores all kinds of ESPN kind of factors, especially the N factor, the environmental factor, and population puts pressure on the environment, right? We know that with any kind of animal. And remember, as humans, just being the highest of the animal kingdom, you know, we put a tremendous amount of pressure on the earth and our natural resources. Generally speaking, when we think about where people live, I always like to share what I call the 5 2s, right? The ecumene is the part of the earth that we live in, and then the non-ecumene is the part of the earth where we choose not to live, right? For the most part. And so therefore, you kind of have this Goldilocks idea. We don't like it to be too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too rocky, too mountainous, in other words, too high of an altitude. You can see this in patterns all over the world where people don't live in places like deserts and polar climates and the rooftops of the world. There are people who live in those places. They're very small numbers of people. And some of those people are the most resourceful and imaginative, and they're overcoming the limitations of their environment. Remember, we talk about environmental determinism versus possibilism back in Unit 1. Okay. So a little bit like Goldilocks. We like it to be just right. So take a look at this arithmetic density. Now, I kind of already showed you a different version of this with the map earlier, but again, we can still see that India has tremendously high arithmetic density. We know that China is high, but not as high as India. India is a little bit physically smaller, but almost just as many people. We can see that Japan has very high density, the Philippines, Vietnam, there's Rwanda and Burundi, the little tiny little microstates there in Africa. Even Israel and Lebanon kind of show up there in that high category. Haiti shows up as a high category of density. El Salvador shows up at a very, very high level. Again, not that it has a big population, but it's a big population for a very, very small space, right? So this is density, just arithmetic, okay? Now, here's a fun way to calculate this. We know that Rhode Island is our smallest state. Could all of humanity, everybody in the world, could we all fit inside Rhode Island? Well, I've done some math for you. Right? I looked this up the other day on the Census Bureau's website. They have this really cool thing called the population clock, and you can see how many people there are in the world. It's an algorithmic prediction. They didn't stop to count. It would take like 120 years to count 7 billion people, and you wouldn't allow anybody to have a birth or a death during that time. It's impossible to do without just math, okay? So let's say almost 7.7 billion people. Rhode Island is 1,212 square miles. You can actually look that up if you want to. There are 27,878,400 square feet in a square mile, right? I know that because I searched it up, right? Remember, 5,280 feet in a mile, right? So 1,212 square miles is 27,878,400 square feet. Now, if we then say, okay, multiply that out, how many total square feet will there be, right? Because we need to now multiply that number. And it's like 33 billion square feet. But we've got 7 billion people, 7.7 almost. So when you do the math, you end up with about 4.39 square feet per person. So can we fit? Yeah. If you walk in my classroom, and I hope one day we're all in my classroom and there's no more coronavirus, but if you look down at the floor, you're going to see that my classroom has these 1 foot square tiles, right? So think 4 of those tiles, that's your space, and everybody can fit. It wouldn't smell nice to have everybody with only 4 square feet. There wouldn't be room for all your stuff, right? But we could fit inside Rhode Island. So the question is not so much the arithmetic density. It's more we need to figure out a better way to calculate this. So we use what we call physiologic population density. And here, what this means is we're only taking into account the land that's arable. Now, if you've started working on your Quizlet, you know that this is one of those vocab words that I put into the deck, right? Because arable land is farmable land, right? It's land that's agriculturally productive. We know that some places in the world can grow food easier than other places. Again, the places that don't grow the food so well, the too hot, the too cold, the too wet, the too dry, and the too rocky, right? So we know that the concentrations of people, even since the beginning of history, we know that humans have flocked to places where agriculture was productive. Ever since the days that the hunters and gatherers figured out that they didn't have to chase their food, right? They could just settle down and become agrarian and grow their food, right? So all these river valleys that are the foundational areas of all the big civilizations in human history, right? There's a reason why those places were the original places, okay? So let's take one of those river valleys, and that being Egypt. And of course, they always say that Egypt is the gift of the Nile because the Nile would flood very regularly and very gradually, and it would allow them to farm in an area that's exceedingly arid, right? Very dry, very hot and dry. So Egypt is a fairly big country physically, has about 70 million people. Okay. And so when you do the math of mass divided by volume, it's only 182 people per square mile, which is not a lot. But if you only take into account the 3% of Egypt that can grow crops, the physiologic density becomes this astounding 9,000 plus people per square mile of farmable land, right? And so that's where you see that physiologic density is a lot more valuable as a geographical tool than just mass divided by volume, right? But again, anytime you see the word physiologic, it's probably going to be married to the word arable land. That helps you on the multiple choice portion of the test, right? So that you could see that those words kind of go together, okay? So how do we know about physiologic density in an era of possibilism? Well, today we know that there's all kinds of technology, irrigation, right? Crops that are genetically modified so that they're less sensitive to drought and that they can handle drier growing conditions, right? We have all kinds of technology now, drones that fly over a field and give the farmer an idea of when the crops really need water and when it's kind of a waste to put water on them, right? So they can actually use all kinds of GIS programs and layers to see that data as well. So it's all about sustainability. It's all about what we call the carrying capacity. And you guys know this in science class as well. They talk about any environment's ability to support, right, the organisms within that biome, right? And that's what we see with humanity, right? Can this place support? So if we're talking about physiologic density, we understand carrying capacity. Can this area support this human population? It's not about whether they can fit or not. We know we can fit in Rhode Island. There's no way Rhode Island would be able to sustainably support that population. And for a fun fact, Rhode Island only has, I think, like 2 million people, okay? So there's also this agricultural density number, which you may see. And this is when you take the unit of land, right, that's farmable, and then you divide the number of farmers per unit of land. Okay. And so this is a good indicator when you start to think about, okay, if you've got a country with a lot of farmers, that's a country that's probably not very economically developed, right? Because if you look at the United States, we have what? 1% of Americans are farmers. And they're these big corporate farms that produce, millions of pounds of food for us a year, right? When's the last time you had to grow something that you ate? Right? You just go to Publix, you just go to the store, you go to the restaurant and, Mom, I'm hungry, right? And then the food just magically appears, right? So when you think about agricultural density, it's kind of like a predictor of how well a country is modernizing and developing, okay? But those are 3 different kinds of density that you should know. Now, we always take these kids on these trips that I've told you about. We went to Egypt, right? And we went on a Nile cruise and we literally were cruising down the Nile. This picture reminds me, so I didn't take this one, right? It's kind of an aerial distantiated perspective, but being on the boat as it went down the river and you could go up to kind of like the top deck, right? It's not like a big cruise ship because you're in a river, but you could go up 4 or 5 decks and then you could just look out. And the one thing that always struck me was that you had this ribbon of just incredible fertility, all these farms. And I mean, everybody there is a farmer up and down the Nile. And in the Delta, where the river hits the Mediterranean. And you got this huge population in Cairo. It's like 15 million people. But you had this ribbon of fertility. And I'm not kidding. Literally, it's like maybe 1,000 yards of green. And then it's all just sand for as far as you can see beyond that. Because this is a country that doesn't have a lot of arable land. And in reality, if it wasn't for the ingenuity of the irrigation from back thousands of years ago, right? They even showed us these things called nilometers, which are like these it's almost like a silo, but it goes down into the ground. It has these steps, and they would measure the Nile water to see how high or low it was. And the Egyptian government would make you pay taxes. This is how Pharaoh collected the taxes. If you had a lot of water, they assumed, oh, well, you probably grew a lot of crops that year. You had a good year, you got to pay more tax. If the nilometer, the water was low, they figured, oh, okay, it was a hard year. We'll give you a little bit of a break. Right? Yeah, you make more, you pay more, right? That's kind of the way it should be, right? Okay. So if you think about physiologic density, look what happens to our map. Suddenly, India and China are not as dense as we thought they were because they grow a lot of food. They've got a lot of space to grow food. But you look at somebody like, Russia, they're just enormous size and not a very big population. Even the United States. I mean, we're blessed, right? Sea to shining sea with this beautiful country. And even though we have a big population, 330 million, right, we've got a lot of space. But look at, Indonesia, for example, the archipelago along the equator there. Look at poor Japan. right? 120 million people, and Japan, it's tough to grow food there, right? They do grow a lot of rice, but it's hard, right? You look at countries again in Central America, countries throughout the Middle East, even some countries in Western Europe, right, that have a lot of people for very physically small spaces that don't have a lot of arable land, right? Or the arable land they have is already being used really to capacity, right? But you look at countries like Argentina, South Africa, they have tons of space, right? And not very big populations as well, okay? So let's talk about some trends worldwide, okay? Basically, this slide is just giving you some numbers, right? Some generalization of numbers, right? And what I want you to see here is that of the almost 8 billion people we have in the world, right? It wasn't always like that. In fact, you don't have to go that far back, right? Just a couple hundred years ago, right? You're talking Earth hits 1 billion people for the first time. But then in 100 years, it doubled to 2 billion, right? And by the time I was born, right, 1969, August 11th, the world population had doubled again. It was over 4 billion, right? And we hit 5 billion in the 80s, and we hit 6 billion by the end of the 90s when Michael Turner came along, right? Katie was kind of the bonus after that. For the freshmen nowadays, oh my goodness, some of y'all are like 2005, 2006, even maybe, right? You guys are now living in a world where you were part of that 7th billion, right? And we're pushing now this 8 billion. Where does it stop? Right? Again, if you want to check out the Census Bureau's pop clock, you can search that up. It's a lot of fun. And I'm telling you, it's addicting to just watch that clock go, right? And it's an algorithmic formula. They'll even tell you for every second, there's like 5 births and 2 deaths, and it just, adjusts as it keeps counting, right? So where do we stop? And I'll show you at the very end of the video, we're going to talk about where we stop, or where we think we're going to stop in terms of population, right? But we know we're going to hit 8 billion here pretty quickly, pretty soon. Okay. So the UN is estimating, right, that by the middle of the century, we could be at least 9 billion. And some people are saying maybe even closer to 10. Okay. And we'll talk about why that's happening, right? It's not really just because of high births. It's actually something else. And if you want to check out the world population number when you were born, there's a cool website. We'll actually do this in class, right? And I'll kind of make you do this as a homework assignment, right? worldpopulationhistory.org. You type in your birth date, and it will tell you what number person you were in the world. It's pretty cool, right? My number is way lower than your number, right? Because again, I was part of that 3rd billion that was being added to get us to 4 billion, right? You guys are part of that 7th billion. So this basically just gives you kind of a number stick here, or a number line that kind of shows you what I was talking about. Look at the frequency of our billions. We're adding a billion about every 12 years, okay? It's very, very interesting. Again, that is projected to level out, right? And we'll talk about that. Okay, here's a fun fact too. I love this image, right? The whole world's population, almost 8 billion. There's more people inside that circle than there are people outside that circle, right? You want to talk about density and distribution, but look what's inside that circle. China's in there. India's in there. Indonesia is almost 300 million people. They're in there, right? They're the 4th populous country in the world, right? China 1, India 2. We're number 3, by the way. 330 million Americans, right? But Indonesia's in there. Pakistan, Bangladesh are in there. They're both top 10. Japan is in there, okay? South Korea is in there. Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, lots of big populations in there, okay? More people inside that circle than out. So where are these concentrations? All right, I'll let you read through this. I don't necessarily have to read all of this to you. I just talked about a few of those places, actually. But it's interesting to see which of these places is rural, which is urban. Remember, there's a difference between the word urbanized as an adjective and the word urbanizing as a verb, right? Places that are urbanized can't urbanize anymore because they already are urban. But places that are urbanizing very rapidly, that means that they've been very rural until now. And remember, I kind of hinted that we're going to see a lot of rural to urban migration, right, in the recent history of the world, right? So look at some of these places: East Asia, South Asia, Europe, and North America. I'll let you read through the slide. Okay, so you had a chance to pause, and you had a chance to look at some of those numbers, right? Don't forget, China number 1, India number 2, we're 3, Indonesia is 4. You can search up the top 10 if you want, and it's easy to see all right, the rankings of these countries with lots of population. Russia, Japan probably falling out of that top 10, right? Countries that are on the cusp of the top 10, Mexico, for example, okay? So, sorry, one little thing that I forgot to click one more button down there, Southeast Asia, right? Which is Indonesia is the big one there, but you've also got countries like Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, right? Some of those are in there as well. But Indonesia, that fourth most populous country. Now, in the United States, we have a cool phenomenon they sometimes call the megalopolis. And this is kind of one big urban area that's been really happening over the last 50 to 60 years, where you pretty much follow that 95 corridor, that I-95 corridor, from Boston through New York to Washington, D.C. That's why they call this Bosnawash sometimes, or Boswash. And it's really just this one long urban corridor. And this currently is in excess of 100 million people, right? Out of the 330 million in the United States, 1/3 of them are pretty much right here. 2/3 of them are east of the Mississippi River. The other third is pretty much the West Coast, California, and the states that are close to it. And then we've got this gigantic flyover part of our country that, we look down and say, oh, look at that, there's Kansas, right? So we don't have a lot of population through the middle of our country. It's pretty much on the two sides. Where are some other clusters in the world? You have to change scale to see these, right? These are not going to show up globally as significantly as the other ones did that I showed you. But if we wanted to zoom in and we say, okay, sub-Saharan Africa, right? Remember, not a lot of people living in the Sahara itself. Sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to see that Nigeria is an interesting case. Nigeria is about the physical size of Texas, which has 35 million people, except Nigeria is like, 5 times that. It's 210 million people living in a space that's the size of Texas. It's incredibly densely populated, and it's a fast-growing population. All of the populations throughout Africa tend to be young, and they tend to still be growing, right? They have not yet achieved the kind of fertility rates that most of the other places in the world have. It's happening. There's a lot of good news going on, but this is still a very young population throughout Africa. Nigeria is the big one, right? But you also have, for example, Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa. All of these countries, right, are young, dynamically growing, and big populations. In South America, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Again, not too hot, too wet, too cold, too dry, too rocky. And so with Brazil, 85% of it is the Amazonia, and there's nobody out there, right? And you see that Brazil's population is pretty much coastal, even though they tried to stimulate growth into the interior back in the 60s with Brasilia. But most everybody's in Sao Paulo and Rio and the big cities along the coast. So Brazil is half of South America's entire population, right? And again, Brazil is so big, you realize there's like only 2 countries in South America that don't touch Brazil, right? So Brazil takes up this enormous piece, and it's half of that population. Okay, so let's talk about dynamics of population. How does population grow? Okay, and so we're going to look at obviously density and distribution, but we're going to look at it in terms of age, and we're going to look at gender, right? Gender groups. And so when we take these cohorts, and a cohort is just basically a group of people like freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. You guys are all cohorts, right? Left-handed people, that's a cohort. So we're going to look at age, sex distributions because we're going to compare the age brackets, and then we're going to compare males and females on either side of the graph. So be careful. They sometimes call these population pyramids, but they're not always pyramid shaped. I'm actually going to show you a lot of pictures here, right? But what we're going to see can dynamically illustrate the change of this population over time. This is also going to tell us a little bit about what we call dependency ratio. Dependency ratio can either be expressed as youth dependency or elderly dependency, or dependency in general, which means both young people and old people. Okay. The United States, we have kind of a lot of both young people and old people. Some countries like Nigeria, I mentioned, very, very youth dependent, right? There are a lot of youth. And then you look at some of the European countries, or especially Japan, which is famously now one of the oldest countries ever in the world. The centenarian population, the people over the age of 100, is now at record levels in Japan. That's elderly dependency. Okay. So what that means is you take the people who are 15 to 64 who are working, and then you compare that, right? You take the numbers below 15 and the numbers over 65 who are not working, right? And you compare that as a ratio to the working population. And that gives you what they call dependency ratio, right? A country with a high dependency ratio is usually a fairly wealthy country, because they can afford for children and old people not to have to work, right? You go to a lot of poorer countries, children are working, old people are working. It's not like you can just kick back and enjoy retirement, your golden years, right? So when we think about dependency ratio, age-sex distributions can give us a hint of that as well. Now, I picked a bunch of different countries here at different levels of economic development. I also wanted to pick countries that later, when we start talking about the demographic transition model, I'm going to come back to these pictures, and I want you to kind of take a mental snapshot of each of these, right? Now, in every one of the graphs, and I'm sorry for my little box being up there in the top corner, but you see males are over on the left and females are over on the right. And I'll just give you a little hint, right? You know, girls are always right? If mama's not happy, ain't nobody happy. So we put girls over on the right, we got the guys over on the left. And then we have the age groups from the bottom to the top, right? From birth all the way up to our centenarians and saying goodbye to everybody there at the top. Now, you notice that this one's kind of like a volcano almost, right? It's got these concave sides. It's super, super vertical, really wide base. What did Meghan Trainor say? It's all about the base. So when we think about this, this is a very youthful population. You can see most everybody is young. This is a population that is still growing, okay? What happens as you get to kind of the next level? You get like a Mexico, a country that used to be growing very quickly, but it's slowing down its growth. Still getting more populated because all the people that were born at the time of higher fertility, they're still alive. They got to move up the graph, and then one day they're going to die, and then it'll kind of slow down, right? But what's happening is it's slowing, and so you get kind of this Hershey's Kiss kind of a shape to it, right? So we know that this is not a rapidly growing population. We know that this is a slowly growing population. Right? They've actually started having mom, dad, 2 kids, and a dog kind of a reality. You can see the bars are all about the same. That each generation is replacing itself, right? But again, the fill up of the adults is happening, right? The children that were born 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, right, are still alive. So now let's look at the United States. And again, we have this famous thing in our history, the baby boom. Well, we should know that those boomers now, they're getting old. They might be, so, we don't want to talk about it too much, but hey, it comes for everybody, right? That's one reality. So when you look, you can see, go up to about 65 to 70 years old. You can see we used to be growing, but then what happened? We kind of got to that, slowing growth. And now we've been basically stable for a long time, maybe even slightly declining in terms of the births there at the bottom. Okay. Now let's go one step further. Let's look at Japan, right? Again, I told you, this is a country where literally they sell more adult diapers in Japan than they sell baby diapers, right? And when we took kids to Japan, it was almost like I gave the kids a challenge. Okay, kids, try to find a baby. Everywhere we went in Japan, the kids were kind of on the lookout. Did we see kids in strollers? We didn't see a lot. We saw a lot of old people. My students kept saying, Mr. Turner, take pictures with those old guys over there, right? I don't know if they were trying to lump me into that category, right? It was a little hurtful, right? So, it's when you look at this is what I mean by these population pyramids, these age-sex distributions. They don't always look like a pyramid, okay? Now, they can even be more funky, right? Oh, by the way, here's Japan projected out into 2050. I mean, literally, it's going to be nothing but old people by the middle of the century. So here's Qatar, right? And now we got this like, what's going on? Why is there this huge, male between about 20 to 55? You got a bunch of guys. Well, this is one of the countries in the world that has these guest worker programs for the oil industry where they bring people in, typically from India, Pakistan, Indonesia. These are other Muslim countries where, there's a lot of immigration for work reasons, and they buy into the culture, right? Because the workers who migrate there are typically Muslim as well. Okay. And so when you look at Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, all of them have these large foreign-born populations. Okay. And you look at those numbers. I mean, it's a tremendous number. Fun fact, the United States is about 14% foreign-born, right? And you look at some of these numbers that they're 50, 60, 70, 80% and more. Okay. So that's why you see on the male side, because typically these guest workers are men, not women. Now, women do sometimes migrate there for work as well, domestic type jobs in the home, cooking, cleaning, that kind of thing, right? But the guys, a lot of construction projects, it's a lot of the oil industry workers, and this is, again, very taxing, physically demanding work. And the Qatari people are able to bring in these guest workers, and then they don't have to be doing the physical work. They're paying people to come in and do that, generally people from low-income places. Okay, so we talk about a dynamically changing population. So what is the formula, right, for how the population grows? Well, we could actually put that formula out here for you. What is TP? TP is the total population. So what do we start with? The original population. And we're going to add births, we're going to subtract deaths, and then we're going to add immigration coming in, and we're going to subtract immigration going out. Now, usually, if we're talking about natural increase, we don't include the immigration part at all. Okay, we just look at the births and the deaths because those are natural things, right? Whereas the immigration, right? I is coming in, E is going out. We generally don't include those here, right? But this is what we call our demographic accounting formula. So let's talk about the births and the deaths. Now, there's going to be a lot of alphabet soup in this unit, right? We're going to have a lot of like CBR, CDR, IMR, TFR. We got all these different combinations of letters. You kind of need to know what all these things mean, okay? Crude birth rate. You basically say, what's the number of live births for every 1,000 people in the population, right? So it's a whole number out of 1,000, okay? We sometimes call this natality, right? Like a mom takes prenatal vitamins, right? So natality has to do with births, like mortality has to do with deaths, right? So we're going to take a crude birth rate, right? If you have 3,872,416 people, and they tell you the crude birth rate is 31, you don't have to get out a calculator. We can do some very dirty mental math and say, okay, let's just take off the last three numbers, the 416, because we're dividing by 1,000, right? So let's get rid of the ones and the tens and the thousands places. And then let's take 3,872, multiply it by 31, because it's 31 births per 1,000, and we can get a round number of how many births there would actually be, okay? Again, I don't think they're going to make you do math questions on the exam, but that's how it works. The crude death rate's the same way. It's the number of deaths per 1,000 people, right? So again, you could take off the 416 and then multiply by 12 if they tell you the crude death rate is 12, and you get an idea of how many deaths there are, okay? Now be careful. Most countries, the birth rate's higher than the death rate, but we do have a few countries in the world that it's reversing, where the death rate is now higher than the birth rate. Not because it's a bad place to live, but because there's generally an older population. And guess what? You know who tends to die very frequently? Old people, okay? They die more than anybody else, right? So be careful when you think about these relationships between the birth rate and the death rate. That's important to see. Okay, now we can take the birth rate and the death rate, and we can also come up with another statistic. We call this the rate of natural increase, okay? Rate of natural increase is sometimes just AKA the growth rate, right? So what we have to do is we take the birth rate, we subtract the death rate, and then we divide by 10. And the reason why we have to divide by 10 is because remember, both of these rates are expressed out of 1,000 people. And to get a percentage, we need it to be out of 100, right? So you take the birth rate out of 1,000, the death rate out of 1,000, divide by 10 so that we can make this a percentage number. And by doing that, right, if you take your, say, crude birth rate is 24 and the death rate is 8, we'll just subtract 24 and 8 and you get 16. Divide by 10, and you're going to get 1.6% growth, okay? And I'll explain in a little bit why that matters about this growth rate, okay? Population change over time. But what we're going to do here, what we're going to see is that, again, a number that's like over 2 is growing very fast. A number that's at 0, the population is not growing at all, right? The birth rate and the death rate are canceling each other out. They're equal to each other. There's no population growth there. Right? Be careful. When you think about no growth, sometimes kids will say, well, that means there's no babies. No, if there's no babies, you're going to be negative because, you know, again, old people continue to die. It's not like you can stop that from happening. Okay. So when the birth rate and the death rate are equal, then is when you're going to have that kind of ZPG, they say, zero population growth. Basically just giving you an idea of the maps here of birth rates and death rates and rate of natural increase, right? If you want, I'll give you time to kind of go back and forth between the different videos here, right? And you can pause and take a look at each one, look at patterns, right? birth rate, right? Especially sub-Saharan Africa, very high birth rates. Afghanistan, very high birth rate. Look at all of Europe, particularly the more eastern part of Europe you get, Russia especially. Look at Japan, South Korea, very low birth rates, okay? And the rest of the places in the world, kind of fairly moderate, right? And you look at the United States and Canada, actually kind of creeping down into these lower numbers as well, right? Crude death rate. And what you're going to see here is you've got, again, sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of this is due to disease. HIV is rampant in a lot of these countries. Malaria is a big killer in these countries. There's a lot of conflict in some of these countries. Afghanistan, certainly conflict. This data is a little bit old. Syria's death rate shows as being very low. That is no longer true because of the conflict in Syria in the last few years. But basically, we can see where rates of death are higher. Again, look at Eastern Europe, where we said the birth rate was really low. Death rate is now higher because, again, a lot of old people, and old people tend to die. And so then you see your rate of natural increase, right? Which is basically birth rate minus the death rate, divide by 10, right? And here's your rate of growth. Anything over 2% of rate of growth is considered very high, right? Rate of growth that's in the below 1, right, is considered very slow. And some of these are below 0, which means they're not growing, they're declining. Okay, now the biggest single part of this entire unit, okay, is talking about the demographic transition model. This is a massive theory based on a guy named Warren Thompson, who said that countries, using a European model of examples, countries would progress through different stages of demographic change with birth rates and death rates over time, okay? He plotted 4 stages originally, but today we generally accept that there could be 5 stages. And these stages are the high stationary stage, where the birth rates and death rates are both high, and the population is not growing because they cancel each other out. A second stage called early expanding, where the birth rate is still high and the death rate falls, right? So you have a gap, meaning births over deaths, and there's population growth there. We have a late expanding stage where the birth rate now is coming down, but the death rate is already low. And then we have a low stationary stage where the birth rates and death rates are both low. And again, the population kind of achieves what we call ZPG. The 5th stage is the declining one, which I've already explained a little bit, where because of elderly people, the death rate starts to creep back up and you end up with a negative rate of growth, okay? Now, the transition, the demographic transition over time is in stages 2 and 3, right? And so what we see in the world today is there's no countries in stage 1, nobody. Everybody's moved at least to stage 2, which means that the poorest countries in the world are still growing fairly rapidly. They're stages 2 and 3. The countries that are kind of middle level of economic development, you know, the Mexicos, the Brazils, the Indias, the Chinas, that they've slowed down a lot, right? And maybe not even hardly growing at all. And then you get the richer countries have all kind of gotten into stage 4, the United States, Canada, Australia, Western European countries, those kinds of places. Stage 5 is going to be those European countries like Russia, Italy, even Germany to a degree, especially Japan, and maybe even a South Korea that are now in a negative, right, stage of growth. Now, we'll talk about migration later, but there's also migration that plays into this too. But this is pretty much what we see when we say the demographic transition. Again, burn this into your brain. This might be the most important thing you can carry with you for the entire course. And I'll show you as we get close to the AP exam in late April, I'm going to bring this back to you again, and I'm going to blow this thing up with all kinds of information, right? That's going to help you get college credit. But again, no countries in stage 1, some of the poorest countries in stage 2. Now, Saudi Arabia, not a poor country. They have a lot of oil money. But again, status of women is a bit of an issue there in terms of, you know, women's rights and family life and those kinds of things. But even in Saudi Arabia, they're moving, right? Every country in the world is moving in a positive direction here towards smaller family sizes, which is decreasing the overpopulation pressures on the earth, right? But again, as you get closer to the richer countries, we see progression from stage 1 through the 2s and the 3s out to the 4s, and then eventually into that declining stage 5, okay? You can read through the pre-industrial, early industrial, late industrial, post-industrial parts, right? I definitely want you to look at that. I mentioned some of these things just briefly, but again, take a second here to read through that. Okay, so you have an idea then of how historically we've advanced through. For example, the Industrial Revolution had a big role to play here. And of course, that happened in Europe kind of from the 1750s throughout the early 1800s, right? Other countries in the world are still going through that, where Europe and the United States went through that 150 years ago, okay? So how does disease now play a role in this, right? Because there's another theory that kind of dovetails with the demographic transition almost perfectly. This guy's name is Abdel Omran, and he talks about how over time, a society will be suffering from different kinds of disease, okay? A poorer country that doesn't have the same sanitation, hygiene, healthcare, medical treatment, and just basic education, they're going to have a lot of infectious disease, right? And this is why we see things like Zika, Ebola, and all these kinds of outbreaks and hotspots of epidemics are typically in poor parts of the world, okay? Richer countries tend to suffer more from chronic, delayed, degenerative diseases, where the body breaks down over time slowly. And this is the United States for sure. Heart disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, all of these things are kind of lifestyle things, right? And they've become endemic to these rich countries, right? And then, of course, we do have those diseases that have a genetic or an inherited component to them. Now, pandemic, we've heard that word a lot lately because that is when you take a disease that originates in a small geographical area with a lot of cases and it goes global, right? Now, of course, COVID certainly fits the bill there. The last time we had a disease kind of like that, 100 years ago, when we had the Spanish influenza that went around the world and killed 20 million people, okay? So different world today. It's a lot easier for COVID to spread because 100 years ago, people weren't traveling as much as we were, right? Obviously, a lot of that has been curtailed, right, for safety reasons. But seriously, when you think about how much this disease has spread and become pandemic, it's very geographical, right? And remember, everything's geography, right? Geography is everything. So this is why this is really important, not just in our class, but you take what we learn in our class and you can immediately apply it to everything you know, okay? And again, take a second to identify examples of these terms. Okay, so here's Omran's epidemiologic transition model. And again, many apologies for Spatial Shark taking up too much of the right-hand corner of your box there. He says that there's this age of pestilence and famine, right? This is when, there was no hygiene, no cleanliness, no sanitation, and people were literally dying young, right? Like 30 years old was an old person, right? Back in the Middle Ages, right? And you had things like the Black Death, right? The bubonic plague and all these, horrific diseases that killed, 2/3 of population. So this is when the birth rate and the death rate were both high, right? People had huge families, but lots of kids died. Very few made it into adulthood to have their own children, right? So again, not a lot of population growth. Remember, it took all of human history up to 1820 to get your first billion because people were dying all the time, right? Now, as you get into your Industrial Revolution age, you get this age of receding pandemics. And the diseases that used to kill, huge portions of the population, well, they were kind of eradicated. Cleaner water, vaccinations, better hygiene, better sanitation. So the death rate comes down. Life expectancy now is going to increase, right? Because you're not dying when you're young. You're not dying as a baby or as a child. You're starting to live into your adult years, okay? So as a result, you see this second stage of disease, and then the diseases shift away from the infectious diseases to the more chronic diseases. You get to that third stage. Now you get the degenerative man-made diseases. What do we mean by man-made? We eat too much, we drink too much, we smoke too much, we're fatty boombalatties, right? Right? And so now we see that the diseases are breaking down our body over time. And the big killers in the United States, by the way, for both men and women now, it's heart disease, right? Heart disease is the number one killer in America. And we have a high rate of obesity and diabetes and all kinds of health conditions, right? So now you get stage 4 where we can delay those degenerative conditions, right? If Mr. Turner wants to, he could probably drop 20 pounds. I mean, I'd have to give up Chick-fil-A. There's a lot of things I like, right? But I could probably weigh a little less. I could exercise a little more. I could maybe take metformin, which lowers blood sugar, right? Maybe I could, get a keto diet, right? So we could delay the onset of these diseases. I mean, we could treat cancer, we can treat heart disease, we can treat lots of degenerative conditions. But then there's that fifth stage, and that's the scary one, where we have the reemergence of these infectious diseases, right? And hey, this whole thing with coronavirus is not unlike this fifth stage, where diseases are coming out of other parts of the world, but are affecting the United States in a really, really big way. Remember, scale of analysis. We can look at that as a global disease. We can look at that as a national disease. Or we can look at that as a sub-national, look in our local communities, right? Why are we learning online? And some of us coming back to school and some of us not, right? We can change the scale of analysis with all of this stuff. Okay, so life expectancy at birth, right? How long can we expect to live? This doesn't mean that nobody lives longer than this. And it doesn't mean that nobody gets to this age, right? What it means is on average. Now, the reason why these averages are really low in those poorest countries is because there's so much infant mortality and so much child mortality. When you got a lot of people dying before the age of 1, it really brings the average down. If you make it through childhood, chances are you're going to live a long time, right? But the reality is that in the richer countries, it's almost expected that you're going to live a long time, right? You kind of know when you have kids that they're probably going to survive. In poorer countries, families have big numbers of kids because they're like, oh, I don't know, maybe some of them won't make it. We need to have 5 and hope that 2 or 3 make it. Well, in today's world, even the poorest countries, the infant mortality is getting better, right? And again, please don't just believe all the bad news you hear. In every country in the world, things are getting better, right? In terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of nutrition, and all of these kinds of things are promoting healthier lifestyles, which is good for these statistics. Now, something as simple as hand washing, right? Which didn't exist in most societies until a couple hundred years ago. But even now, as we educate in poor countries and say, hey, we got to be clean. We got to make sure the water supply is clean. We got to make sure that the food is clean and healthy, right? Because this eradicates our child mortality problem. And therefore, we can increase the life expectancy. Now, on the other tip of the other end of the scale is you got a country like Russia where, again, lots of drinking, lots of smoking, lots of crime, and you got an older population, and death rates in Russia are now alarmingly high, right? This guy's only 26 years old. I'm just teasing. But what we say is that, these older populations are being afflicted with these degenerative conditions, okay? And again, we could all probably be a little bit healthier. So wouldn't this be a great essay if they used the verb compare to talk about, the deaths by broad cause group, right? You've got the richer countries on the left. You've got the poorer countries on the right. Look what they die of, right? This is Omran's model in a graph, right? What if they gave you this as the visual stimulus and said, compare the data on the graph? How are they similar? How are they different? One country's rich, one country's poor, one has more infectious. All of them are dying. They're just dying of different things, right? And then you could bring in Omran. I mean, this would be a great FRQ prompt, right? If you start to think like an item writer, right, you're really going to do a good job on the exam. If you can think like we think when we design questions, right? Remember, I've told you, I write tons of questions for the AP exam. Okay, here's the reality. We're all going to die. Okay, let's just hope it's no time soon, but we're all going to die. So Thomas Malthus was a British clergyman and a writer about this idea of population. And he saw this alarm, kind of a Chicken Little, right? Oh my God, we're not going to be able to survive this. He was living in 1798. Now think about this. This is a world that had not yet really hit 1 billion, but it was getting close. And particularly in his scale of analysis in the UK, he was seeing this huge population in and around the city of London, which at the time had horrible sanitation, right? Huge family sizes, lots of deaths, especially young deaths. And by the way, it's interesting. Thomas Malthus, right? Charles Dickens, the author, used Malthus as his inspiration for the character of Ebenezer Scrooge in the Christmas Story, with, Tiny Tim and, Cratchit, you with your too many kids and your poverty and you want my charity. And, if you've ever seen that story, if you've ever read these Dickens kind of tales, right, of those stories of poverty in the UK at that time, right? Malthus, by the way, was like one of 11 kids or something like that. He was the youngest. He probably had a sucky childhood. It's no wonder he thought, it's too many people, right? We're overcrowded. We're all going to die. What he was saying was that the linear food production could not keep up with this exponential growth of population, right? It's almost like he plotted it out on a line, right? You've got linear food production, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. It's growing slowly. But he said population is like 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. It's like exploding with population. Remember the Irish potato famine, which was middle 1800s, right? The British government at that time, right, really kind of said, hey, let's not really help the Irish. It's not like the British, English didn't really like the Irish anyway, right? There's all kinds of religious differences and all kinds of cultural differences. The Irish don't like the English either, right? But the British government literally said, let's not save them, because if we do, we'll just encourage them to have more kids, right? Let's let them die, right? It's their fault. They had too big of a family and they can't feed themselves. Oh, by the way, the English took all the potatoes. There was a potato famine. It wasn't like there was no food. It's just that the English took all the good food and left the Irish with nothing. So what happened? A lot of them immigrated, right? With an E. They left Ireland. They came to America, right? These are like Spatial Shark's great grandparents, right? Take a look, right? I mean, I'm about as Irish and Scottish as it gets. So when you think about this was the time period that there was death and there was despair and there was famine and conflict. So Malthus argued that there should be preventative checks. People should have moral restraint. Don't have big families, right? Stop after a couple of kids. Of course, in those days, it wasn't like you had a lot of family planning options, right? All right. The only real option was, okay, abstinence, let's not have kids. Well, good luck, right? The reality is that today, right, we have a lot of these options to lower fertility, but he was arguing moral restraint, or if you didn't do that, you were going to get the positive checks. You were going to get the famine. You were going to get the death. You were going to get the despair. You were going to get the disease, and population would check itself. That was his theory. So, of course, we know he's wrong, but he couldn't have predicted all of the improvements in agricultural technology. He was before any kind of steam engine, before any kind of big, increases in food supply, certainly before refrigeration and before all kinds of things to make food healthier and better. And today we produce, think about it. We produce enough food for over 8 billion people, right? Right? We waste a ton of food, right? He's saying, oh, we can't handle 1 billion people. Well, clearly that's wrong, but it's not like it's his fault, right? I mean, he couldn't see into the future. But the reality is there are neo-Malthusians in the world today, and they say, okay, he may have been wrong at the time, right? But it still could happen. We still do have famines once in a while. They're usually the source of man-made conflict, though, not because we don't have enough food. And these neo-Malthusians will also say, well, it's not just about food. What about climate change? What about lack of water? What about scarcity of resources? What about, we don't have the energy to continue to live this way, right? So that's what they call neo-Malthusian arguments. Well, then there's the cornucopian side that says, well, don't worry, there'll always be plenty. The cornucopia is that big basket full of, fruits and vegetables and grains. And we're always going to have an abundance because humans can overcome the limitations of the environment. Doesn't that sound a lot like determinism versus possibilism, right? From Unit 1. Okay, so what is linear and exponential growth? I kind of said it already, so I'm not going to read too much of this slide. But again, linear, 2 plus 2 plus 2. Exponential, 2 times 2 times 2, right? Y equals mx plus b, plot the line, right? Plot the slope. There's a reason why I teach geography and not geometry. And then we think about the doubling time. Now, this is where that rate of growth that I did a while back is going to become important again. The rate of natural increase, we can take that and divide it into the number 70. It's called the rule of 70. Don't ask me why the number 70 works like this, but it does. You can divide the rate of growth into the number 70, and you're going to get the number of years that it's going to take to double. Now, this works for population. It also works for your bank account. If they're paying you 0.5% interest, right, it's going to take 140 years for your money to double, right? Because the number 70 divided by the rate. So if it's 1%, that goes into 70 times, right? 1% would be 70 years. 2% would be 35 years. It's twice as fast, so it takes half as long, right? Any country in the world growing at faster than 2%, you know that their country's doubling in less than 35 years. That's a Nigeria problem, okay? Where lots of children, right, growing. And when you look in Europe, you see that those growth rates are like close to zero. Those countries aren't going to ever double. In fact, they're more likely to decline than anything else, okay? We'll talk about aging in a little bit. So again, remember 2%, 35 years of growth, right? Slower than 2, slow growth, right? Higher than 2, fast growth. So then we talk about demographic momentum, right? Because I don't know if you've ever been in a car, you're like out on the turnpike, you're going 75 miles an hour, right? When you take your foot off the gas, you don't stop. You slow down, but you continue to go pretty fast for a while, right? That's the idea of demographic momentum. So you can't wave a wand, bibbity boppity boop, and go, boom, everybody in the world's at replacement level fertility right now. It doesn't work like that. It takes a long time for fertility to slow down, for the birth rates to, remember the demographic transition. The death rates all over the world are pretty low. The birth rates are coming down. In rich countries like ours, the birth rate's already low, right? But in those poorer countries, they still have a lot more kids, but it's slowing down. It's getting better. But this is what we mean by demographic momentum. I looked up these numbers for you, right? Last year, and I rounded the numbers off, there were 140 million births worldwide. There were 60 million deaths worldwide. What does that mean? We're adding 80 million people a year, okay? Well, 12 times 8, that's 96, right? So that's 960 million. Guys, that's almost a billion people. Every 12 years, we're adding a billion, okay? But it is slowing down. The momentum, okay? The fastest growth is still occurring in the poorest countries. The richest countries, they sometimes don't even achieve replacement fertility anymore, okay? China famously enacted a one-child rule for like 40 years. They've recently relaxed it. We'll talk about that, right? But the reality is that globally, the average is getting close to that magical, right, ZPG, where the birth rate and the death rate are kind of equaling each other out. So if the growth rate is declining, why are we still adding 80 million people a year every year? Well, here's why. It's demographic momentum, okay? So in the 1970s, the population growth rate of the Earth was 2.1%, and there were only 4 billion people. Remember, I was one of them, right? 1969. So I was one of that 4th billion there, right? So if you take 4 and multiply times 2, you get 8, okay? 4 times 2 is 8. Well, look, 20 years later, you get into the mid-90s, the Earth was hitting, a little over 5 billion, right? And it was almost on its way to 6. The rate of growth had dropped to 1.6%. I don't know if you do the math, 1.6 times 5, okay? I mean, I could do this with you, right? I'm going to have to use my calculator because I can't do like that kind of math in my head, right? But 1.6 times 5, shut the front door, it's 8. It's the same as the other rate of growth, even though the base, right, was a bigger, the rate of growth had slowed down, but the base is bigger, okay? Remember, all about the base. Well, now we've got almost 7.7 billion people. It's actually almost 7.8. And we're at about 1%. Well, again, if you take almost 8 billion and you multiply by the 1%, 8 times 1 is 8. So even though the rate of growth keeps coming down, we're still adding 80 million. It's this inevitable fill-up of adults. The only time we're going to ever really stop is when we get that rate of growth to be 0, where the birth rate and the death rate are going to cancel each other out. And until we get to that time, we will not stop. But we are getting close all over the world on average, right? We're getting close to this idea of ZPG. But this is the momentum that is continuing, right? That's how it's happening. So many African countries, I've told you, are very young. Take a look at this. Look at the countries in Africa that have percentages of their population under the age of 15. You look at, again, Nigeria there in West Africa, 40% or more. And most countries throughout the region of sub-Saharan Africa are huge portions of the country under the age of 15. Okay, so stop and think for a second here. How many kids have children under the age of 15 had so far? Well, here's a hint. 0. They're children themselves, right? But the key is going to be what happens in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. When they start to become child-raising adults, will they buy into the 2-child family? Will they have the mom, dad, 2 kids kind of a reality, right? Because until recently, Nigerian fertility was like 4 children per woman. Back in the 60s, it was like 5 children per woman. And now it's getting closer to 3. Right? But the reality is, if we don't get all these countries to buy into a 2-child reality, right, then we're going to still have population growth, even if the richer countries are now below that, right? The other thing that's going to happen, and we'll talk about migration later, is that there's going to be incredible pressure to get out of these kinds of places and go someplace else that's got opportunities and that's got a better life, right? Because if you're in Nigeria the size of Texas, and if I tell you that Nigeria is going to double because it's youthful and growing, it's going to double in like 35 years. Guys, that's going to be 400 million people in an area the size of Texas. Now, we think Texas is big, and it is, but 400 million people there. You look at a place like Uttar Pradesh, a big state in northern India, is physically the size of Colorado, but again, 400 million people living there. There's incredible pressure to migrate and to go somewhere else, okay? Overpopulation is always going to kind of push people out. So how can governments play a role in this? Okay, well, they can have these population policies. Historically, we've seen a lot of countries that were expansive. They wanted the population to grow, right? Now, a lot of times these are dictatorships and they think, oh, I'm going to have a big army. I'm going to take over my neighbors. I'm going to get a lot of land. Remember, every conflict in the world is about land, okay? So you saw Mussolini would give out awards. Mama Leone would have like 17 children, and they'd be like 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12. She'd have like a baby every year. And that's an expansive population policy. We don't see a lot of these in the world anymore, except countries that are now really old and they're fearful that their populations are going to decline. Now, suddenly, like Japan's paying women like $10,000 if you have a baby, right? They're giving out free health care. They're giving all kinds of bonuses, right? Please have kids. You could have a restrictive population policy, right? Which is where they're trying to reduce the population, right? And that's where a lot of countries in the world are doing things like family planning. They're handing out free contraceptives. They're doing all kinds of sex education classes, which until recently, that's been kind of taboo and, traditionally not acceptable. But now it's becoming very normal, right? Regardless of religion, regardless of culture, regardless of the place in the world, right? People are starting to say, hey, we want to have smaller family sizes, okay? I'm going to show you some funny things here, with Singapore and Denmark and some of these places. We'll do this in class where we'll kind of see some of the policies that they're enacting, right? Singapore very famously encouraging people to have more kids, right? And then finally, we can see what we call eugenic population policies, where they say, well, we only want kind of this group or that group. And Japan has typically been very eugenic. Right? They want Japanese. It's only just in the last few years of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who, by the way, just resigned for health reasons. We're going to have a new Prime Minister of Japan. But only in the last few years has Japan started to really open up and allow more immigration in. Okay. So again, we think about China's one-child policy, right? The one-child rule. We're going to talk about all of these things, right? But remember, expansive is pro-natalist, right? Restrictive is anti-natalist, right? So they want to reduce. Okay. And again, I'll show you a little teaser about National Night in Singapore, but I'll show you that in class. Okay. So where are women using this family planning, this idea of contraceptive use, this idea of, preventing pregnancy, right? Well, look, China, very high number, right? That one-child rule was very, very, very instrumental. Western Europe, right? The United States, Canada, Brazil. And that's interesting because, again, regardless of religion, think about it. The Muslim world, the Catholic world, very famously for a long time, even still, the Catholic Church's official position is that, that birth control and that family planning, no, you're not supposed to do that. But yet you've got all these countries like Italy and Brazil and Spain and all these countries that are very, very high, right, on family planning, even though they're Catholic, right? And even in the Muslim world, you have countries like Egypt and Iran and Algeria and Turkey, where women are a lot more modern, right? And are saying, okay, yeah, I'm in with this idea of a smaller family size, right? And in China, it was always famously thought of that, it's a lot more easy to raise a successful child if it's one child than if you have two kids, because now you got to divide your assets, your income, your attention, and all that between two kids. You can have one more successful kid, right? And so then you think about families that were 5 and 6 and 8 and 12, and it's like, oh, what's the chance of them all being successful? Because you don't have enough resources. Now, again, in the United States, not that long ago, it was like that. My mom was one of 7, right? When I used to go to family reunions, I had like 30 cousins, right? But my dad was an only child. His mom and dad were both only children too. I have like literally no living relatives on my dad's side except for my dad, right? And my brother and I, we're the link, right? And so we got Michael, we got Katie, and then my brother's daughter, Sarah. That's it. That's the Turners. No pressure on Michael. He's the only boy. And he's the third Charles, right? Yeah, Charles, my dad, Charles, me, Charles, my son. We all use different middle names. Terry, Kevin, Michael. Okay. So think about family planning. Now, How does this factor into the rate of increase that I showed you before? Take a look at this. Where the family planning is the lowest, the rate of increase is the highest. Where the family planning is very popular, the rate of increase is 0 or close to it. Oh, we're looking at relationships, right? We're looking at patterns, and we're looking at the processes, right? Economic, social, cultural, political, right? Environmental, right? Economic reasons to have a smaller family, social acceptance and cultural acceptance to have a smaller family, political governments encouraging you to have a smaller family, right? And the environmental conditions that, hey, we don't have enough food, we don't have enough resources. Okay, so one of the best examples of this, of course, is the one-child rule that happened in China, basically from the 70s until just recently. And they had all kinds of government educational initiatives about the one-child rule, right? Sterilizations for one or both partners in a relationship if they had more than one child. You could spread out the births over time. And again, I'll give you a second. I'll pause and I'll let you look through all the stuff here on this chart. But a lot of abortions, a lot of pregnancies that were averted, right? And really what happened was fertility came way down. Now, fertility was already dropping in China, right? As a country modernizes and as the role of women changes in society, they generally have less kids anyway, right? But when you look at these numbers, right, you just see that there's an overwhelming, right, impact of this one-child rule. And one of the unintended consequences, right? The intended consequence was to lower fertility. Okay, well, that's the intended consequence. What's the unintended consequence? Well, people preferred males over females, right? And the preference for boys meant that a lot of girls were either given away for adoption or were aborted, right? Unwanted. And so now, 20, 30 years later, you have some demographic imbalances, gender imbalances, where you got a lot of lonely guys, right? Because there's not enough women for the male population, because for a long time, families were putting a preference on boys. Today, the Chinese government, remember, they control state media, right? Now you'll see TV commercials and all kinds of ads where it shows a family and it's always like a mom and a dad and a little girl. And it's like they're really promoting the idea. Girls are great, right? Because now they know, hey, if we leave it up to people's choice, they'll choose boys a lot, right? And by the way, that's not uncommon in India either, right? Where we have common Hindu wedding blessings where it's like, I hope you have 3 sons, right? Because the idea that if you have girls, you're going to be high and dry in the future because, girls go off and marry into the husband's family, but it's boys that support mom and dad in their old age. Well, if you have nothing but girls, who's going to take care of you, right? And this has been true in Japanese culture as well, okay? So when we see these restrictive population policies, there's all kinds of unintended consequences, and there's all kinds of impacts that happen that are not just economic, but are social cultural as well, okay? So here's how fertility rate for China started. You can see when the one-child policy went into effect, it was already low, okay? They were already seeing fertility come down. So the one-child rule didn't create the low fertility. It just kind of cemented it. It made it permanent, okay? So much so that China now is looking at the other problem of saying, if you have two parents and only one child, every generation down the line, at some point, you're going to be losing population, right? Because you're not replacing the generation. And now they're looking at that and they're saying, whoa, what are we going to do? We need people to have more kids. So now they've relaxed this one-child rule. Now they're saying, okay, well, have 2. Well, once you get a lot of women to have 1, it's like, oh, wait, you want me to have another kid? Right? And I'm working and I'm busy in the house. And I got, by the way, most moms have 2 jobs. And it's like, think about what your mom does. If you tried to pay her, you couldn't afford her for everything she does for you. And now you're like, oh, have more kids. Right? Ooh, I'm kind of enjoying my life that I have now. I don't necessarily want to have more kids. So far, the Chinese people are not buying into this, oh, let's have more, right? Okay, what are the limitations and the contradictions? No government policy is ever going to be 100% effective. I mean, we talk about efficaciousness, right? Nobody really wants the government to tell them how many kids they're going to have. So even under the one-child rule, China's fertility dropped to 1.75. It never really got to 1. There were all kinds of exceptions to the one-child rule, okay? So when we say improving status of women, right, the role of women in society all over the world has changed. Women are becoming educated. They're becoming empowered, right? Think about Malala, right? I'm going to get shot in the face, but I'm still going to go to school, right? So as the role of women is improving all over societies in the world, then we also see that fertility is falling, and we also see that these rates of growth are coming down. Okay. And that is something you have to be willing to, you have to think about this. If you get an essay about population, you're going to have to talk about the role of women, right? That used to be very traditional, right? Oh, you're going to have babies and you're going to cook and you're going to clean and you're going to be domestic and you're going to stay at home and you're not going to get an education. The boys can go to school, but you're not. In the world today, girls are going to school more than ever before. And in some countries, there's now a gender imbalance where there's more girls in school than boys, even in some of the poorest countries in the world. Okay. So it's important to see that things are getting better everywhere in the world. Things are modernizing and improving. And the status of women is one of the real big achievements in that. And it's having an impact on population statistics. Okay. By the way, China's other big unintended consequence is not just the male preference, but what happens if China gets old before they get rich? Every other country in the world got rich and then they became old. China's getting old before they fully get rich, right? Remember, China is a big, big economy, but it's still nowhere close to like the economy of, say, European countries or the United States or Canada or Australia. Not even close when you think about GDP divided by the population per capita, right? But China's aging very, very rapidly. This is a picture that I actually took. We went to China in 2006 with students. And this was at the Terracotta Warriors, right? The tomb of Shi Huangdi, one of the early emperors of China. And there was this kindergarten class. And, being a teacher, I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. And we got to teach about the one-child policy and everything. So I said, okay, I'm going to take a picture of the class. And then I started looking, and I was like, there's kind of a gender imbalance here, right? Because you kind of look around and you say, well, got some little barrettes and clips in the hair and some, cute little girls over here. But there's only, 4 or 5, maybe 6. The rest are all boys. Well, there's your gender imbalance right there. This is the reality of the one-child rule. And this picture was from, 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, right? This is still happening. This is still real, right? Where you see this preference for boys, right? And I don't know why, but I love the fact that Chinese kids, anytime you take a picture of them, they're always like, eh! They love to give you a little peace sign, right? It's just everywhere. If you point a camera, yeah, they're all excited, right? We had one kid on the trip, super blonde. She was from Iceland, and everybody wanted to just touch her hair, right? They loved the fact that she was looking different than they were. Okay, look at CBR decline. Look at the countries that are really dropping their birth rates, right? And you see, again, these countries that used to have, high numbers that I showed you a minute ago, a lot of them are really improving. Again, education of girls, empowerment of women, employment for women, women that have their own life, women that get to make their own choices, women that are not, dictated to by a man, whether it's dad or whether it's boyfriend or husband or whomever, right? I am woman, right? You go, girl. And so we've got this empowerment of women where fertility and birth rates are going to come down. Okay. So what are some of these other population policies? I talked about eugenics. Certainly there's no other eugenic policy more famous than what the Germans did in the pre-World War II and during World War II era, the horrific history of the Holocaust, the final solution, right? The extermination of anybody that didn't meet that standard. 6 million Jews, right? People that also failed to meet that Nazi ideal, right? Communists, homosexuals, anybody who was different, right? And so when we think about the Holocaust, the sad reality is a lot of American kids now, they're doing surveys where 1 in 10 kids say they've never even heard of the Holocaust. What? How have you never heard of this? Right? And 2 or 3 out of 10 say that, I've never really been taught anything. I know what it is, but, and you think about in Palm Beach County, I think we do a pretty good job, right? And I know at Spanish River, I know that in the social studies department, we teach this, right? So the reality is that when we think about these population policies, this is real, it's history, right? We had laws in our country's history that excluded Asians from migrating to our country for a long time. There was actually a law called the Oriental Exclusion Act of the 1880s, right? And they were always, it's always the same thing. We're afraid they're going to take our jobs and those kinds of things. The reality is population policies can be very eugenic, right? And they can be racist and they can be xenophobic, right? They can be afraid of, and they can pin foreigners for, you're the cause of all the problems. We don't want to let you in, right? And to the point that they can target them and persecute them, or even as in the extreme case of the Holocaust, try to exterminate them, right? It's very sobering to think about these population policies, right? And what humans do to each other. That's just horrible. So we talked about women and we've talked about demographic change, right? And again, total fertility, I've mentioned it, TFR, right? It's the average number of children that a woman will have during her reproductive lifetime. Generally, as a country gets richer, women are going to have less kids, generally speaking, okay? Now, if you change scale of analysis and you zoom in and you say, okay, wealthy families might have more kids because they have a bigger income and, they can afford to have 3 kids or 4 kids or 5 kids. But globally speaking, right, fertility falls as countries get richer. Fertility always falls as girls get more of an education, right? Fertility always falls as women work more outside the home, right? Again, it's just the opportunity cost, right? If they're busy working outside the home, they don't have as much time for being in the home, having children, raising children, right? Parenting children, okay? So TFRs all over the world, they're dropping, okay? And 2.1 is what we call replacement level fertility. Now, this is an interesting number because why isn't it 2, right? Mom, dad, 2 kids. You would think that that's replacement, but it's actually 2.1 because there is the reality, sad as we may think of it, that some babies don't survive past 1 year, right? And if we have infant mortality, that means you can't have mom and dad and exactly 2 kids because some kids die. So therefore, the 0.1 accounts for that infant mortality. So if they ever ask you about replacement level fertility, right, it's 2.1. So here's where world fertility is, right? Now you look, who's below 2.1, right? China's below 2.1 now, right? Japan has been below 2.1 for a while. All of Europe is below 2.1. Canada's below 2.1. This data is just a little bit old, right? We don't have a date on this, but if I remember correctly, the United States, if I remember correctly, we're like 1.9 now, 1.9, 2.0. We're just barely under replacement level fertility. If it wasn't for immigration, our population wouldn't be growing anymore, right? It's not like 150 years ago where the average American family was 3, 4, 5 or more, right? And in Africa today, sub-Saharan Africa, and in the Middle East, right? Afghanistan, Pakistan, even in places like Laos, right? Which is just next to Vietnam over there. You can see that family sizes are still like above 4, right? And they're falling everywhere in the world. They're falling, but these are big family sizes. And that's where the growth is still occurring in the places. And by the way, if you map infant mortality and fertility, where the infant mortality is the highest, that's where fertility is also high, right? Where babies die, families have more babies. It's important to remember. So if you want fertility to get lower, you kind of need to save poor babies from dying, okay? So look at how fertility is falling in the world and in all different regions. And in many places in the world, that fertility is now below replacement level fertility, okay? So the goal always has been that countries will ease into this replacement level fertility, okay? Very famous teacher, edutainer, right, as I like to call him, Hans Rosling, who just passed away a couple of years ago. Probably nobody else is as famous in the world of human geography as Hans, right? And fun fact, his son Ola has now taken over his work, and Ola follows Spatial Shark on Twitter. And if you want to follow Spatial Shark, you might see some tweets by Ola Rosling as well. But Hans made this movie just before he died called Don't Panic. And it's about population, and it's about all these statistics. We're going to watch it in class. And it's this idea that, if we want to get fertility, if we want to get to 0, population growth, if we want fertility to be 2.1, to just replace and not grow, then we have to understand that we can't let poor children in the world die. We have to save poor children from dying. And people, it's ironic. People think, oh, all these young kids, they're going to explode, they're going to add to the population. Globally, we've already hit peak child. On average, remember, the rich countries are having less than 2. Right? And the poor countries might be having more than 2, but globally, the number is replacing itself, right? But the reality is, scale of analysis, if we look at just these regions where fertility is still high, we need them to buy into the 2-child family because it's creating overpopulation pressures in those places, right? And so there's, again, the pressure to migrate, and there's all kinds of problems with short-term famines and short-term disease and those kinds of things, right? But globally speaking, things are getting way, way, way better, right? We're getting close to this idea of replacement level fertility, right? But Hans says, don't panic. We've already reached peak child, okay? So what will the consequences be, right? Migration that I mentioned, right? And again, child mortality, which we're trying to eradicate, right? All kinds of impacts economically, socioculturally, politically, environmentally. There's Hans, right? Hans died of pancreatic cancer. And his book, by the way, is called Factfulness. If you ever get a chance to check that out, it's an amazing read. It's an incredible view of what we don't know about the world, right? And for a geography buff, it's really fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about that infant mortality rate. Remember, it's children who don't reach their first birthday. And I really shouldn't have said the word children because it's infants. A couple of years ago on the AP exam, there was a question about IMR, and students wrote the word children, and we were told, can't give them credit because infant mortality is below the age of 1. There is child mortality, which is below the age of 5. So because students wrote the word children, they weren't talking about babies. You got to be careful, right? As you write these words and as you learn your vocabulary, right? These are babies that don't reach their first birthday. Again, women are the key to this because a healthy mom has a healthier baby. A mom that's more educated knows how to take care of her baby better, right? A mom who's more educated has a better job with more income, and they can afford to take the baby to the clinic and get vaccinations and have better food and better hygiene and better sanitation, right? So remember, women are the key to so many of these demographic statistics. And so here's where you see infant mortality rate. And look where it's high. It's in the countries that are the poorest, the countries that are having the most problems with conflict, right? And with famine and those kinds of things, right? Infant mortality is almost non-existent in the rich world, right? Infant mortality is very, very common in poorest countries. And again, this is out of 1,000 live births. It's not out of 1,000 people in the population. So when you see 100 deaths for babies out of 1,000 live births, guys, that means 10% or more of babies are not making their first birthday, right? In the United States, that number is like 3 out of 1,000, right? And those are always like horrible accidents, right? Or some horrible disease. And in these poorest countries, it's oftentimes just malnutrition. It's diarrhea from contaminated water, right? And these poor little babies, their bodies can't handle it. So will developing countries follow suit with all of this idea of the demographic transition and dropping fertility and all? And again, so far, the news is really good, right? Everywhere in the world, regardless of religion, regardless of culture, regardless of politics, regardless of any of those things, we see that a lot of these countries are transitioning, right, to a better life, right, a healthier life. But there are some countries in the world where leaders say, hey, there's a good thing about demographic dividend. A big population, that means there's more workers and there's more ideas and there's more potential, right? So there are some countries that are still encouraging big families, right? Even though, generally speaking, a smaller family size means more opportunities, okay? But the demographic dividend is this idea that we need a youthful population, right, to grow and work and pay taxes and do all those kinds of things. Okay. But the longer a country stays in stage 2 or 3 of this demographic transition model, the more their population is going to explode. We need to get countries to transition through the model quickly. Okay. So of all the rich countries in the world, we're the one that still has the highest fertility. And again, this is a real big credit and testimony to American moms, right? Especially the working moms, right? And I love, oh my God, when people say, oh, your mom doesn't work. Really? Just because she doesn't necessarily drive to a job and have a paycheck, mom works. Trust me, right? I've seen mom's job. I don't want that job, right? So help your mom, right? This is very difficult, right, to be a parent. So we are the only country in the world that still has a fairly high fertility rate amongst rich countries in the world, right? Statue of Liberty, pregnant, pretty funny. But what about aging populations, right? And again, remember, big long slideshow here, big long video. You don't have to watch this all at once. You can cut and make popcorn and watch it with friends a little bit at a time. So aging populations, how has this happened? Right? Remember, Europe used to be growing just like Africa, Latin America, Asia, are growing kind of today. Europe used to be like that, right? And we used to be like that in the United States. But over time, with the advent of technologies and innovations and hygiene and medical advances and better food and clean water and all that, death rates fell. The birth rates stayed high. There was a big explosion of population. But then at some point, the birth rates came down. Remember, right? Malthus was sounding the alarm about overpopulation. Now we've got countries sounding the alarm about, oh my God, we're not having enough kids. We need you to have more children. So this impacts the dependency ratio, but not the youth dependency. Now it's the elderly dependency ratio that they're concerned about. So you see a lot of European countries are saying, okay, well, maybe we have these guest workers come in. And you're seeing a lot of people from Africa. If you've been to any big city in Europe lately, you see a lot of young African men in big cities across Europe, and they're working. You see a lot of immigrants from the Middle East, from Muslim countries, Turkish people going to Japan, Algerians going to France, right? Syrians coming into, a lot of countries in Central Europe, as Sweden as well. You're seeing, Libyans coming into Italy, right? It's very common for people from this Maghreb region of North Africa to move into Western Europe, right? And there's some conflicts, right? There's some xenophobia conflicts. There's some not so nice behaviors by Europeans towards these people who are not European. And at the same time, these people come and they enrich the culture. They make life more vibrant and diverse, right? So this is where aging has economic consequences, right? Because if you're aging, you don't have enough people to work to support the elderly. So you got to bring in workers because you're not having kids yourself, right? And we're going to talk about Denmark, right? If you don't have these migrants come in, who's going to do the work, right? And if you don't have people working to pay taxes, who's going to pay for the welfare state? Who's going to pay for the Social Security? Who's going to pay for these things, right? If you're elderly and not working, right? So this is the dilemma that Europe is facing as a consequence of aging, okay? So I mentioned Denmark. I'll show you this video, right? And you may choose to go home and share this as well. And the translation basically is, save Denmark with a romantic holiday, right? And so what they're saying is take a vacation and maybe get pregnant while you're there and then come back to Denmark and have more babies, right? Because Denmark is aging and they're not having a lot of kids, right? So get away from the stress and the pressures of the everyday and take a vacation, right? Get pregnant. So remember when I said earlier that we're not really growing anymore because of fertility and we're not really growing anymore because of, an exploding population? It's the inevitable fill-up of adults. So this is from Hans Rosling and from his Gapminder Foundation. And you see we're kind of replacing, right? Every generation's replacing itself. The 2 billions are replacing the two. Every stick here, every person is 1 billion. And what's happened is the people who are above 60, right? And it's really sad when you see the video with Hans. He says, those are the people that tend to die. That's where I got that line from. And sadly, when Hans was making that video, he knew he was dying. He had the pancreatic cancer already. He knew he wasn't going to live much longer, right? And he was like, and I hope, right? The delayed disease, remember? He's like, I hope I can live longer, right? But that's the population that's about to die, right? And they're going to be gone. But then the 2 billion are going to replace them, right? So that's how we kind of know we're going to level off at about 10 billion, right? Because each generation is replacing itself. But we're not even at 8 yet. So we're still growing to get to 10. Why is it going to take until 2060 for it to stop? Remember when I told you that I was part of that before the 4th billion? Remember when I told you that my mom was like one of 7? And remember when I told you that even in richer countries back then, there were bigger family sizes? Now it's like 2 per family. Well, back in the day, 50 years ago, there was still a lot more fertility. We're still alive. All of us that were born back then, right? And so now what you're going to see is that they have to grow up and they have to die. And then the ones younger than us, because Mrs. Turner and I, we had 2. We were both 2-child families when we were kids. We had 2. I expect Michael and Katie will probably have 2. My guess is many of you are from a 2-child family. But all of us that were born at a time of higher fertility, we have to grow old. I'm getting there. And we have to die, and then the earth will balance out. And we think that's going to happen at about 10 billion. And after all, look at 2060. I was born in 1969, right? Think about it. I would be 90 years old, roughly. I hope, maybe, I don't know. It's like 40 more years. I mean, what am I going to do for 40 more years? I don't know. Right? As they say in Spanish, demasiado, right? It's enough. I don't know. But I don't know if I'm going to see 2060, right? And kids always say, when I used to say, the kids are going, don't say that. Well, I don't. The reality is the life expectancy is like 75, right? I don't know if I'll see 90. There's no guarantee. Okay. Let's transition. I know we're at 90 minutes, right? And I know you can stop and pause and take a break, right? I'm doing this straight through, but you don't have to. Okay. Let's talk about migration. There's 3 topics in Unit 2 that talk about migration. And so basically the first part of it is they talk about causes of migration. And remember, we always ask about where and why there, right? We always talk about, the patterns and the processes, right? Why are people leaving that place? Why are they choosing to go to that place? What are the patterns and process? And why should we care, right? What are the economic, social, cultural, political, and environmental impacts of migration? And if you want to really have some fun with this, right? Ketchup, salsa, sriracha. I love this idea. Maybe we'll do this in class, talking about the origin of these 3 sauces. I don't know if you know, but none of those 3 things are American. All of those things are here because of migration, right? Ketchup, right? From the UK, but originally from China. Remember, the British owned a lot of China for a long time. And it was actually a fish sauce, like a fish paste. And then over time, it just kind of became what we call ketchup, right? Salsa, obviously from Mexico and Central America, and sriracha coming from Southeast Asia, right? And all of these things, just again, they enrich our life. They make our life taste better, right? But again, we wouldn't have these things if it wasn't for migration. Okay, so migration is the long-term relocation of people, right? It's not just movement. It's not just a vacation. It's not going away to college. It's migration is long-term relocation, right? I'm moving there. And immigration with an E, you're leaving. Immigration with an I, you're coming in. They kind of sound the same, but they are different. And remember, this can affect the growth or decline of a population over time. Okay, but again, generally, if it's natural increase, we don't consider immigration. There's also internal migration, what we call domestic migration, where people move around within a country. Remember, we're changing scale of analysis there. Okay, instead of talking about interregional from one part of the world to another, we're talking about internal migration within the United States. Old people from New York who like to come to Florida to retire, right? So we know that there are pushes and pulls. I'll talk about those in just a second. And remember that we can map these things, and there's always this true map, false impression of maps, right? For example, one of the biggest movements in American history is the Great Migration of Black Americans out of the South to cities in the North and the Midwest and the West, right? But if you look at the racial breakdown of our country, you're going to see that most Black population is still in the South. It is a legacy of the enslaved people that were brought here against their will, 300 years ago, right? And after the Civil War, there's still a big Black population in the South, right? In the Carolinas, in Georgia, in Mississippi, Alabama, right? Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas. But the reality is that millions moved out of the South, right? And we'll talk about the pushes and the pulls in a second. But if I map, I can see that the impact of the Great Migration is big Black populations in places like New York and Detroit and Chicago and LA, right? Big cities of the North have large Black populations. They moved there, not necessarily the ones that are there now. It's the great grandparents that did it because, again, they were pushing and pulling, right? Their choices, right? Even though the South still has a big population. Well, here's the idea. And I'll tell you, the push was political and social, right? Jim Crow laws, right? The whole separate but equal, right? That was never, ever equal. It was always separate. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, right? And it's not until Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in 1954 that changes. But it's not like racism went away. I mean, I think we kind of know that, right? But by the way, it's also not true to say, well, they pushed out of the South because they didn't like the conditions there. And then they went to the North and then everything was great. Really? There was never racism in places like Chicago? There was never racism. Remember the Flint water crisis? That wasn't happening in white suburban golf course neighborhoods, right? So the reality is that the geographers have to look at all of this in a very unbiased way, okay? But this is that push out of the South. But there's also the pull. Because, hey, there's no real jobs here in the South, right? We're not getting hired. We don't have an opportunity to work, right? Particularly World War I to World War II, a lot of factory jobs in the North. And so Black Americans moved to those big cities looking for jobs. Okay. Some stayed. And by the way, there's some return migration as some Black people move back to the South. And you're starting to even see some of that today too, leaving the big cities of the North and coming back into the historical, home of the deeper South, right? So again, voluntary migration is always a combination of what we call pushes and pulls. Okay. Pushes kind of cause you to leave, and pulls drag you to another place. Usually the pushes are going to be felt stronger, right? Because the pulls are far away. And that's kind of Tobler. Everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things, right? And every country in the world has push and pull factors going on. In the Middle East, for example, we have those guest worker programs that I mentioned, where they're pulling workers because of the lure of high-paying jobs in the oil industry and in construction. And so there's also the push factor of poverty. If I'm living in Pakistan or if I'm living in Bangladesh and I know there's a job in Saudi Arabia, I can go over there and I can make money and send money back home. These are called remittances, right? Where they send money back through these guest worker programs. So again, here are these push and pull factors, right? And I'll give you a second to take a look at these. So basically, what has happened is you see places like China and India, Mexico, Brazil, right? All of Southeast Asia. People have been kind of pushed out by conditions and pulled to other locations. And this is just the United States, by the way. Almost 50 million people in our country now, right? Foreign born. Most of them from Asia and Latin America. It's not Europeans anymore. The time of Europeans coming to America, that was like 400 years ago. Now it's mostly from Latin America and from Asia, right? That's our minority populations today. It's changing everything. It's changing the economic scene of our country. It's changing the political scene of our country. It's changing the social cultural aspects of our country. Okay. But this idea that we don't have migrants in America, we have a lot of migrants. Now, 50 million sounds like an awful lot, but remember, we're 330 million in total. Okay. It's about 14%, 15% of our country is migrant, right? Or foreign born, I should say. And then, of course, there's a lot of children of those foreign born now. Okay? Some of us in our class. So you look at these patterns, again, from India, right, through Southeast Asia into Europe, from Africa into Europe, from Latin America into the United States, and Canada too. Canada actually takes in more migrants by percentage than we do. They don't take in as many as we do because we're 330 million and Canada's like 1/10 of that. Okay? But again, Europe takes in a lot. You'll notice that this is, again, rural to urban. And it's from poorer places to richer places. These are common denominators. Here's a cartogram that shows you this. There's that United States population. Again, huge numbers of migrants into the United States. Okay. Notice that a lot go into the Middle East because of the guest worker programs. Notice not many are going to South America. Not many are going to Africa. Those aren't destinations. Those are usually source areas. Look at how many are going into Europe. Right. And notice that Asia, not really having anybody coming in. Right? It's almost all going out, right? So what are these remittance sending countries? I mentioned the money that they send home. Look at the United States. How many billions of dollars we send, right? These migrants that come to the United States, and then they'll send that money back home. For some countries, those remittances are a big part of their whole national economy. Countries like Haiti, countries like Mexico, countries like El Salvador, right? Countries like Jamaica. Right? They get these remittances that we send home. Turkey, Russia, people come to America, make a lot of money. They send it back to grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles and cousins and in-laws and brothers and sisters, right? So Germany sends a lot of money back home, right? Again, I mentioned Turkey. There's a huge pipeline between Turkey and Germany. A lot of the guys on the German soccer team, Mesut Ozil, right? Skodran Mustafi, a lot of these guys are from Muslim countries, Turkey and Albania and these different places, right? Sami Khedira, right? So when you look at this, this is where people are going to work and then they're sending money back home. So what should we know about American migration? We have a lot of domestic migration in our country, right? The internal movement. Most of it is south and west historically. But why are some states gaining and other states are losing? Okay. So we can look at patterns, right? Most Americans are leaving cities and going to suburbs. At least historically, that's been the trend. Especially with COVID lately, lots of people are leaving big cities if they can, right? But right now is not the best time to be moving because it's tough with the economy. Getting jobs is tough. The unemployment spiked a lot because of the disease, because a lot of the shutdown of the economy. But generally speaking, if you're rural, you move rural. If you're suburban, you move suburban, right? But if you're urban, right, a lot go to suburban areas. And that's been the trend in the United States historically. So look at states that are losing, and look at states that are gaining. Okay, New York losing big time, right? And this is from just a couple of years ago. The data probably would be a little bit different if we tried to find a 2020 map, which I did try to find. Is about the most recent that I could get that was good data, right? But look, South Carolina. A lot of people don't realize South Carolina is the only state in the United States they're making both planes and cars in South Carolina right now. Charleston area is exploding. Huge dynamic growth in South Carolina of jobs and opportunities, right? And great schools there too. Look at Florida gaining, Tennessee, the new South, right? Nashville, where I was born, right? It's hugely popular amongst young people, right? And again, look at places like Chicago, right? In Illinois, right? You look at Wyoming and North Dakota. That's partly because of the oil boom of a couple of years ago with the fracking. And now some of that has gone away. And so now people are leaving because who really wants to stay in North Dakota? Alaska, kind of the same thing, right? But look at California at negative 3.5, right? I mean, any push factors there? Any environmental push factors? Fires, right? Tough economy, all of those things. Generally speaking, the North is losing, the South and the Southwest, the Sun Belt is gaining, okay? Now, what if I change the scale of analysis? Same map, right? It's the same national map, but it's a county level scale of analysis. It's more localized. And so now I can see Florida gaining, but look at Miami-Dade County. It's actually losing, which means that people are leaving Miami and are going to other places. By the way, Central Florida gaining a lot, with the exception of Orange County, which is Orlando itself, right? So they're not going to Orlando. They're going to all the suburban communities around Orlando, in Seminole County, in Osceola County, in Brevard County, okay? So again, you can see that we change the scale of analysis and we see that it affects the data. Okay. Again, look at South Carolina at almost 10%. And then you look, it's really only Charleston and in the area around Charleston where that growth is coming. Okay. So Ravenstein historically came up with these laws of migration. I'll give you a second to read through these. Okay. And basically these rules were observations from about 200 years ago. So how has the changing role of women affected this? Well, it used to be women didn't move by themselves. Well, today, girls go off to college. Girls move to a different city. Girls can get their own job. They don't have to wait to get married to move to another city or move to another place. I mean, it used to be that families didn't want single daughters living on their own. That was just not acceptable in society, and it was maybe a little dangerous, right? But now, women are empowered, right? So we do know, though, that one of Ravenstein's laws is still pretty powerful, and that is that migration between two shorter distances is always going to be more than migration between two longer distances. And this is what we sometimes call the gravity model, okay? And so basically we could do it as a formulaic expression, the population of the first place times the population of the second place, divided by the distance squared between them, which, by the way, that is the formula for gravity out in the universe, but we're just making it geographical. Population of the first place, population of the second place, multiply them together, divide by the distance squared between them. Two bigger places closer together will have more migration. Two smaller places farther apart will have less migration. Duh, right? But this is why it makes sense that Africa, which is physically closer to Europe, is going to send a lot of migration into Europe as that population is young and growing and bigger. Not too many Africans come to the United States. Some do. And by the way, the Africans who come to America are generally the highest educated immigrants we have, because anybody that can make that move is usually very, very skilled and highly educated and usually has a great job, a lot of university type work, a lot of technical work, a lot of big business work, right? But then you see Latin Americans coming to the United States in big numbers, but they don't necessarily go to Europe and they don't necessarily go somewhere else because, again, too far, right? Tobler, right? Everything's related to everything else. Near things more related than distant things. And remember, too, that if you're in stage 2 and 3, overpopulation pressure, that's a big push. There was a guy named Wilbur Zielinski, and he says that migration transition occurs too, kind of like the demographic transition. If you're in the exploding population time, that's when people are pushed, right? And where do they go? They go to countries that are like stage 4 and 5, where they need young people and workers, right? It all makes sense. You got to connect all this different part of this slideshow. Here's that illustration of the gravity model. two bigger places closer together will have a lot of migration, right? And smaller places and farther apart will tend to have less. Okay, that's kind of distance decay as well. We've talked about Tolbert already a lot. When you make a long distance move, you typically move in a lot of steps. You don't make the one big move. You kind of go here, 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 here. And it's like step, stop, step, stop, step, stop, step, stop. And every time you stop, you might get what we call an intervening opportunity or an intervening obstacle that'll eliminate the continuation of the move, right? And we can kind of show this, the distance decay, right? Closer together, more interaction, farther apart, less interaction. And we can see how from A to B, there could be things that stop you, legal things, economic things, or you run out of money, or, you know, the immigration authorities don't let you stay and they make you leave and you get deported. You know, there's all kinds of intervening opportunities and intervening obstacles. So basically we make migration into two categories. The ones that are voluntary, they have choice, and the ones that are involuntary, they're forced. Okay. And so you can see here that a lot of times we'll see what we call chain migration. Somebody in the family moves, and then there are these kinship links where they'll stay in contact with the family and they'll say, hey, you should come too, right? We see this a lot in Europe and in the United States, right? As people from less developed countries economically come and they get a job or get an education, and then they'll bring the wife and the kids, and they'll bring the grandparents, and they'll bring other family members along. And they typically will end up in these ethnic communities within big cities in the United States. This has been happening in Miami with the Cubans for a long time. Right? This is how Mrs. Turner's parents came, right? Back in 1959 and in 1960 and then beyond. Okay. So when you think about the migrants of today, they're generally higher educated and more skilled than the migrants of, you know, Ellis Island. If you've ever been to the Statue of Liberty and gone over to Ellis Island and seen the history of the people that came through, a lot of migrants to America in the 1800s, they were poor, they were rural, they were farmers, right? The Homestead Act of 1862, come to America, we'll give you 30 acres of land, and all you got to do is pay $30 and agree to live on it for 5 years, and then it's yours, right? And you look at all these Germans and Scandinavians that came to places like Minnesota and the Dakotas, and, you know, they were farmers, right? Which is why we have so many Lutherans in that part of our country, by the way. They all came from Scandinavia, right? It's why you got all those great hockey players up there in the great white north. So when we think about migrants of the old days, this is not the migration of today. The migration of today is oftentimes young, kind of college-age people. And they come to the United States and they're studying. And this is why you guys have to be on your toes, because this is the competition of getting into the more competitive colleges. It's not just American kids that they're accepting. It used to be okay to be the C student in Indiana because the genius in India wasn't necessarily coming to America. Well, now they can. And not even, you know, think about it. They don't even have to come to America because now jobs can be anywhere. Right? With the World Wide Web, with all of the technological innovations and connectivity, right? You better not be the C student in Indiana anymore or in Boca Raton, Florida. Okay. So think about it. Migration is changing the story. We create diasporas or diasporas, right? This is China in red and India in green there, or gray. Don't make fun of my disability. But it's the movement of people away from their home, but they create these connected communities all over the world. Okay. And you'll see that this is true. Like, look at where they've moved. Particularly, look at the guest workers from India that are going into the Middle East, right? And into English-speaking parts of the world. Because remember, India at one time was a British colony as well. Look at China all over Southeast Asia. Remember the movie Crazy Rich Asians, right? All the Chinese migration into Singapore, right? Which I went to Singapore, and it was just incredible. They took us to all these places that were Chinese heritage, but they're in Singapore, okay? Look at the foreign-born population in the United States. And again, remember I told you it's almost 15%, okay? And it dipped for a long time. Obviously, the Depression throughout World War II and in the post-war recovery and in the stagflation of the 60s and 70s, those weren't great times to come to America. And our policies didn't really welcome as many migrants back then. We had quota laws and we had all kinds of difficulties. It's only during the Cold War and beyond that we said, hey, wait a second. We don't like communism. So anybody from communist countries, come to America. We'll take your brightest and best. We'll take all your talented people, right? If you wanted to leave communist China, if you wanted to leave Vietnam, if you wanted to leave Cuba, if you wanted to leave any of these places, hey, come to America. We're all for it. Look at that rise from the 80s through the 90s into the 2000s. Now, lately leveled off a little bit, not just because of government policies, although that's a little bit of it, also economically, right? It's not exactly the best time. The American economy is not growing as much as some other economies are. And if I'm a Hispanic person, I can either come to America where it's a different culture, different language, different reality, or I might be able to go to, say, Mexico, which has a dynamically growing economy compared to the rest of Latin America. And oh, by the way, if I go to Mexico, I don't have to reinvent my identity, right? Because it's Hispanic, right? So when you look, the United States is kind of leveling off, but guys, we're still accepting large numbers of migrants every year. It's still happening, right? Even though all we hear is kind of the polarizing political arguments on both sides about, the migration. Historically, again, this shows you, we used to be European migrants, but that was 100 years ago. Now we're Latin American and Asian and even to some degree, African migrants coming to the United States. So here are our leading sources of migration. Obviously, Mexico, big number because it also has a bigger population, okay? China and India, big populations, but they're also really, really far away, right? Philippines, Vietnam, also large numbers as well. Vietnam's not particularly on here. It's probably just off the next one. Cuba, also very close to the United States, right? And a lot of Cubans have come to America, right? Mrs. Turner especially, not her, but her parents. And again, you see the sources, right? People from Haiti and South Florida. We have a lot of Haitians in Palm Beach County, particularly in Delray Beach. A lot of Jamaicans in South Florida, right? We see people coming from Central America. Sometimes the United States men's soccer team and the women's soccer team, they play against teams like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. It's almost like it's a home game for the other team, because if you go to a big city like Washington, D.C., there's a huge Salvadorian population in Washington, D.C., right? So when you see the impact that these immigrant groups have on their communities, right, it has an impact, not just economic, not just political, social and cultural as well. Okay. So again, there's forced migration, right? And I'm going to try and wrap this up in less than 2 hours. But forced migration, you don't have a choice. The biggest one in all of history, the African slave trade, right? Tens of millions of Africans displaced, brought to the New World, initially by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Later on, the English obviously did the same. The French did the same. This is why the most common color in a lot of Caribbean countries' flags is black. It's representing their African heritage, their Pan-African heritage. A lot of greens and yellows in their flag as well, right? In the United States, of course, this led to the whole Civil War and the sectionalism and the fight over slavery. Brazil also emancipated slaves very late, 20-something years after the United States. But this is why you see a lot of populations in the Western Hemisphere are racially mixed populations, particularly in Latin America, because you see this massive forced migration of people from Africa during the slave trade. Also forced migration during the Holocaust with the Jews who were fleeing from Europe, many coming to the United States, many going into what is today Israel. At the time, Israel didn't exist yet legally. It was still at that time Palestine. Obviously leaving from Russia, leaving from Western Europe. We can see a lot of refugees today from the Middle East, particularly in Syria, right? But we also see the Rohingya Muslims who are in Bangladesh, and they've been displaced from Myanmar because of the genocide and the attacks on them from the Burmese government. We can see Venezuelans getting out of Venezuela and coming to South Florida. We have a lot of them, in our school, right? And so when you see these refugee movements, right, we have refugees who have status because everybody knows, they have a well-founded fear. The asylum seeker hopes that they will get status. So they arrive and then they have to kind of legally prove that they have a reason to be fearful. They have to go in front of a judge and they have to get interviewed and all those things. And the asylum case may not go your way and they may say, oh, no, you got to go back, right? But refugees automatically have that status, right, by international law. The asylum seeker is hoping for status. And then there are the internally displaced persons. They're refugees, but they just haven't crossed the border. So they're internally displaced. And you see a lot of times these tent cities that are put up by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, right, to help take care of them. Right? There's the graph showing you the slave trade, right? You can take a look at that. Again, large numbers in the Caribbean, especially, Brazil, especially. Believe it or not, we have a big history of slavery in the United States, but we actually did not have one of the bigger populations of African slaves coming in, right? Remember, we outlawed the slave trade about 1807. That didn't mean we outlawed slavery, right? Obviously, the rate of increase of the slave population was still very high, but new slaves, right, after 1807, that had ended. So when you look at this, you see the impact, right, of this migration, right, this involuntary migration. Okay, I'll let you read about refugees. A lot of statistics here. Again, I mentioned the UNHCR, big numbers, 68.5 million, right? I'll give you a second to read through the slide because I want to save a little bit of time. Okay, and we can see where, right? I mentioned Myanmar, right? And a lot of them are fleeing into countries like Thailand next door. Obviously, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, right? Fleeing into places like Turkey, fleeing into places like Pakistan, fleeing into places like Iran. We have a lot of conflict in East Africa, South Sudan, Ethiopia, right? Rwanda, Burundi, right? Fleeing into places like, Kenya, right? Tanzania. And then in the Western Hemisphere, we have, of course, the issue with the FARC rebels and the narco terrorism problems in places like Colombia. A lot of people in this map might even not reflect it all yet. A lot of Venezuelans now going into Colombia, right? Not all of them coming to the United States, but Ecuador also houses a lot of those as well. Also conflict there in West Africa, Sierra Leone and Libya. Okay. So what exactly is a refugee? Again, they have to have a well-founded fear. That's the definition from the UN. Right? But who gets to determine your fear, right? Particularly for those asylum seekers. They have to prove that they have a rightful reason to fear, okay? We don't usually think of environmental disasters as creating refugees. It's really a political thing. But obviously, with the earthquake in Haiti is a good example. The earthquake in Nepal is a good example. People are going to be pushed, right, because of the fear of those natural disasters. Take a look at the next two pictures. Which one is refugees? Is it this one? Or is it this one? Right? And it's hard to tell, right? But generally, we say, okay, if it's a lot of young men, we assume that they're coming for economic reasons. This is almost all men here on these boats. And you see this all over the Mediterranean. The Italian Navy picks up boats like this almost every single day, right? And in the EU, they have policies. If you pick up the migrants, you have to keep them. Right. This is why Greece has a lot of problems with these islands out in the Mediterranean. People from, the Middle East, and especially they use Turkey as a conduit, and then they get out onto these islands that are Greek, and they say, okay, here we are. Right now, you got to take care of us. And a lot of times the European countries are like discouraging this. They're like, we don't really want these people. Right. These are refugees. You see this humanity stream. Look, they're taking everything they own with them. Right. And there's children, and there's whole families and whole villages and communities, and they're fleeing in fear. Right? So again, it's difficult sometimes to determine a person who's coming for political reasons versus a person who's coming for economic reasons. Historically, in South Florida, we've seen this with Cubans versus, say, Haitians or Bahamians, right? Where in Cuba, because of Castro, our government said, hey, if you're Cuban, we'll take you no matter what. But if you were from any of the other islands in the Caribbean, it's like, hey, slow down. You're not really coming for political reasons. You're coming for economic reasons. Well, the reality is most Cubans who came for political reasons came a long time ago, right? Cubans that are coming now, it's not always because of politics. Oh, that was Chanel, and she just scared me. So that means we're almost time to be done, right? Plus, I got an Arsenal game to go watch. So when we think about refugees and we think about displacement, this is a big issue. Okay, what are the effects of migration? Chanel, what are the effects of migration? These are all big topics, right? In the Schengen Agreement, right, in Europe, we had this agreement where in the EU, they had this Schengen Agreement where they allowed workers from any part of Europe in the European Union to freely move to any other European country for work. Well, the French foreign minister was like, oh, great, all these sexy Polish plumbers are going to come take jobs. Well, the Polish government kind of said, okay, well, we'll just make a poster with a sexy Polish plumber on it and say, hey, I'm staying in Poland. You should visit. That's pretty funny. So when you think about brain drain, these are the brightest and the best and the most talented people who are leaving their country of birth, and they're going for educational and employment opportunities to other places. There used to be this idea that America was stealing the world's doctors, right? Because doctors from Pakistan, doctors from Cuba, doctors from Brazil coming to America because they can have a better life here than back home, okay? So again, migrants change the culture of the country, right? They enrich the culture of the country, but that can be a conflict as well as people fear the changing identity of the country, right? A little bit of that xenophobia as well. Okay, so non-EU born population, remember I told you that a lot of migrants are coming into Europe. all right, especially into Scandinavian countries like Sweden, but also into Germany. Germany by far takes in the most of these migrants. And then, right, in the United States, we have a big migration issue. And again, talking about building a wall or not building a wall, right? But the reality is, wall or no wall, we still have migration, right? We still accept millions of migrants every year into this country, okay? Lots to think about in Unit 2, right? If you need any help, don't forget to send me a remind text, right? And I'll see you in class, and we'll talk about all of these things.